Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, the other day I was on a flight and I finally had the chance to watch the Marvel movie Doctor Strange. So, better late than never, I thought I would give a review and share my thoughts on the film. First of all, the things that I really liked about this movie. Other commentators have said it, but I don't think there's any harm in repeating this because, man, this was one of the really good features of this film. The fight scenes really are quite amazing and they're something to behold. I watched this on a small screen on the back of a seat on a plane, and even I was impressed with what I saw. I can only imagine it becomes even better looking when you watch it in a large cinema complex, and I'd imagine that it become even more phenomenal if you're actually watching it in 3D. The effects and the fight scenes, they really are quite cool. In fact, there were a couple of times when you really sort of got that real strong sense of comic book imagery, and there was some uniqueness to what they did with the world and the way that it all tied into the characters and the story. So yeah, probably a big 10 out of 10 for the action sequences and the fight scenes. I also really love the fact that this was a new character that we were finding out about in the Marvel Universe, and probably even more importantly, it wasn't just another member of the Avengers team. It was a totally different Marvel character who sits outside of that sort of group that we've been hearing and seeing so much of over the last couple of years, and I think that was really good. It made it just that a little bit more appealing and interesting to watch. It's always good to find out about new characters, and I think it was good just to sort of break away from that Avengers mold for a bit. There was something refreshing about that. The other thing I really loved about this film was the ending, the crescendo, the battle crescendo, if you like. Unlike other superhero movies, this wasn't about a team or an individual superhero engaging in all-out pitch warfare with the bad guy and then beating him into submission or imprisoning him or killing him or whatever, and basically winning the day that way. This was, in fact, quite unique. It was about an act of self-sacrifice, a very creative act of self-sacrifice, and the way in which the end of this film comes about, I think, was really refreshing. It was a unique and creative take. And I think particularly with the concept of what this film was and the way the story was structured, it worked in really well with that as well. So once again, big 10 out of 10 for the ending to this particular story. Now for the stuff that I found frustrating or really didn't like about this film. First of all, I didn't like the way in which they were using the term natural law early on in the film. Basically, they sort of use it to refer to interfering with the space-time continuum, or interfering with the timeline, and how that was a violation of what they called natural law. I found it frustrating because I'm passionate about ethics and philosophy, and that's obviously not really a correct use of the term natural law. But secondly, and more importantly, it actually struck me as kind of arbitrary, because the whole point was these characters and their superpowers are all about interfering with the laws of physics. So why is it just that one particular area where you're not allowed to interfere with to make the world a better place? It felt too arbitrary, particularly as the story progressed and we found out that there's one particular character who has been clearly breaking the rules for quite some time, one of the good guys, and yet they were still maintaining this sort of arbitrary concept of not violating the natural law that they talked about. It just didn't quite sort of sit right with me. I felt the training montage and the development of Doctor Strange's skill set happened way too quick. It just didn't feel, maybe the movie was intended to convey the fact that there was a long period of time between when he started his training and when he became quite skilled, but it just didn't feel that way. It felt rushed, and it just sort of didn't really feel, it's not really a matter of being realistic or not, because this is a comic book movie after all, but I think it would have felt a bit more natural if there'd been a progression of time there. I compare this to, say, Batman Begins, which had a similar sort of beginning where you've got a character, a superhero, who is learning some important skills that he needs. And with that, you really felt that there was an appropriate amount of time. Now, they wouldn't have had to have elongated and lengthened the movie by much at all to do this. It would have just, there's some creative little tricks they could have used to give us, the viewers, sort of a sense that more time had passed. I don't really understand why they felt they needed to rush it. The other thing I think that perhaps played into this was the fact that they, at the very beginning, they sort of they show their hand a little bit too much. They show us who the bad guy is, and I felt like maybe they could have revealed that a bit more slowly, and perhaps that would have taken off the pressure, if you like, because it also felt like perhaps they were trying to train him up quickly so that he could defeat this very serious evil threat that they were facing. But it just, in the end, it sort of, none of it really quite works, because it also feels like you start the film with this big sort of dark happening and this very serious threat that they now face, and then they sort of go back into it's almost like a holding pattern while they're waiting for Doctor Strange to turn up so they can train him. It's just like they don't seem too worried about this, and yet at the same time this threat perhaps is meant to be why he needs to get trained so fast. It just, for me, it just didn't quite work. For whatever reason, it just didn't sit that well with me as in the way that the film conveys that part of the story. There were a couple of character changes that I kind of thought were interesting. First of all, there's the fact that at one point in the second half of the film, Doctor Strange announces that he is not happy about having to kill people. And it just seems really weird, because it's not like he has to kill people in cold blood. We're talking about here protecting the world, protecting the universe effectively, and in the process of defending and protecting the universe, you might be faced with a situation where you have to use lethal force. But basically, Doctor Strange is a universal police officer, and just like policing, sometimes, regrettably, you might have to use lethal force. But in the film, they set up this idea that Doctor Strange is really not happy about that at all, and he even uses his former career in medicine and says, I didn't become a doctor to kill people. Now, that's kind of interesting, because in actual fact, the way they set his former character, his former life up before he becomes the superhero and he's a surgeon, he really is a guy that you could actually see being quite comfortable with having to kill someone if it was a matter of self-defense, if the end justified the means, because they really set him up as a character in that way. He's a guy who's very egocentric. He is living in a really flash house. He's driving a really expensive sports car. We are even shown a scene where he breaks the rules in order to achieve this good outcome of saving a patient. So it's not like the film starts with him as some sort of altruistic missionary doctor who is this sort of leading this very moral, character-driven life. It's really not who he is. And so it's kind of really strange when all of a sudden he announces that he doesn't believe in killing in the name of self-defense, and that he didn't become a doctor to sort of kill people. He's really all about morality and character. It just sort of didn't quite seem to fit with how they had established him as a character. In fact, he even goes on this journey of seeking out this supernatural power out of sheer desperation, because he wants to get his surgical skills back, which have been robbed from him after a car accident. He's totally obsessed with himself, and he's willing to do anything to get those skills back. So it just sort of seems strange to all of a sudden have him announcing that he's passionate about morality and virtue and character. There was also another character development which seemed kind of strange. One of the other key characters shifts from the good side to the bad side, but the reasoning or the motivation doesn't quite seem strong enough to justify such a mammoth shift. It's just he basically it's a case of disillusionment. But the reason he's disillusioned is because he is passionately committed to being a virtuous superhero, and he thinks that his master effectively, he views his master as having broken the rules, and he finds this really difficult to comprehend, and he sees that as a serious failing on her part. So it's kind of strange that after seeing something as a serious moral failing in someone that you'd formerly looked up to, that you would actually swing so wildly to the dark side and become this evil arch villain yourself. It comes across as he's either really deranged and evil, or he has now developed mental illness, but it just doesn't seem like a very legitimate or strong motivation for such a strong swing in a character. Another thing that I found really frustrating about this film was the soundtrack. Michael Giacchino, I hope I'm saying his name rightly, that's how I've been pronouncing it for a while now, so hopefully I'm getting that right, seems to be okay with wholesale copying his previous soundtracks. I was watching the film and listening to the soundtrack, obviously, and all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, why is this soundtrack so familiar? I've heard this before in another movie, and sure enough, it is almost the same score that he has used previously in the Star Trek films. And it was just so frustrating because it's not just like a little motif or a sound or a particular style like you get with, say, someone like James Horner or Hans Zimmer. He's wholesale lifted a major thematic, a major musical cue, a major musical theme from one movie and plonked it straight into another movie. And they're both big budget films. They both would have been widely heard. And so, yeah, I really found that really distracting. It pulled me right out of the film. And I found it frustrating because he has produced other music that's different and original to the Star Trek soundtrack, so I'm not sure why they felt the need to just imitate that same major thematic element and bring it over into this film.
Computer says no.
And the last complaint I have is not really a complaint, it's more of a questioning. Now that we have this new character in the Marvel Universe, Doctor Strange, who has these profoundly amazing supernatural powers, it really does raise the question, does this now negate the need for the Avengers? Because this guy can do things that really do outrank and make him far superior to the Avengers. Now, obviously, there are some films coming up where those skills will come in handy, but it does raise the question, when you go back to those regular Avenger-type movies, will there be this sort of big lingering question, where is Doctor Strange and why is he not helping, especially since the end credit scene in this movie sets up Doctor Strange as being a purposeful and deliberate universal policeman. He's actually interviewing Thor because he views Thor as a possible threat to the world. So he's taking these duties very seriously. He clearly sees himself as like a guardian of this world. And so it does raise the question, if he doesn't show up in future movies to save the day, why not? And why would we be relying on lesser characters when we have this guy who is clearly so powerful now? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and whether they have creative ways of getting around that problem, because this was already starting to become an issue when you had films, individual superhero films, that were separate from the Avengers, which of course raised the question, why is the whole team not here? So it'll be interesting to see whether this Doctor Strange development has any sort of bearing on our willing suspension of disbelief, if you like. So there you go, that's my review of Doctor Strange. All in all, I found it actually a really enjoyable film. I wouldn't say it's anything particularly groundbreaking. The action and the fight scenes, they were really quite special and something to behold visually. But there's nothing really groundbreaking in this film, but it is enjoyable. It was a new character. There was a few little original concepts in there, that enough to make it an enjoyable action film. So I guess the big question is, if I'd gone to see this in a theatre instead of watching it on a plane, and I'd had to pay money to see it, would I walk out of the theatre happy about the fact that I'd had to pay to see this movie? The answer is yes, I would. I'd be quite happy. As I said, it's nothing groundbreaking, but I would have walked away feeling quite satisfied that I'd paid money and I had experienced a good movie experience out the other side of it. So if you get the opportunity and you haven't seen it already, then make sure that you do check out Doctor Strange. And if you have the ability, I would encourage you to check this out in 3D, because I can only imagine that it's going to enhance the experience of this film. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.